The house was too quiet, the kind of quiet that didn't feel peaceful, but heavy, like a held breath waiting to be exhaled. Richard lay on his king-size bed, eyes open, staring at the ceiling. He had tried to sleep, but his mind refused to quiet. His wife, Margaret, had left that morning for a week-long business trip, leaving him alone in the house with his son, Ethan. Richard was a man of discipline, a husband of 23 years, a respected corporate consultant who had built his life upon structure, routine, and expectation. He had done everything society demanded of him, married young, had a son, built a career. But beneath all the polished success lay a truth he had spent decades suppressing, locking it away in the deepest parts of himself where no one could see. At 21, Ethan was everything Richard wasn't: fearless, confident, and unburdened by shame. He had come out at 18 without hesitation, without apologies. When he had brought his first boyfriend home for dinner, he had done so with a smirk, eyes flickering to Richard as if daring him to acknowledge the truth within himself. Richard had never acknowledged it. He had nodded, kept his expression neutral, and played the part of the accepting father. But deep down, something in Ethan's confidence had shaken him to his core. It was why being alone with him in this house felt different. Margaret had always been a buffer between them, the silent wall that kept unspoken things from spilling into reality. But now, there were no walls. No distractions, just the two of them, circling an invisible line neither had dared to cross. Yet, that evening, Richard had tried to maintain normalcy. He made dinner, poured himself a glass of whiskey, and sat across from Ethan at the dining table. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, but it was charged. "You look tired," Ethan had commented, watching him. Richard had shrugged. "Long day." Ethan smirked. "Or long life." Richard's grip tightened around his glass. He had ignored the remark, steering the conversation towards safer topics. But even as he did, he felt the way Ethan studied him. Not like a son looking at his father, but like a man dissecting another man's secrets. Now, lying in his bed hours later, Richard knew he hadn't escaped that gaze. It had followed him, seeped into his thoughts, stirring something in him that he didn't want to name. Then a sound. Soft footsteps outside his door. Richard turned his head toward the bedroom entrance. The handle shifted slightly, but didn't turn. Just a hesitation. A presence lingering on the other side. Ethan. Richard's pulse quickened. He wasn't sure why. It wasn't as if Ethan had never been outside his door before. But tonight felt different. The air was thick with something unspoken, something dangerous. Seconds stretched, and then, as if deciding against it, the footsteps retreated down the hallway. Richard exhaled. He should have felt relief. Instead, he felt something far worse. Disappointment. Sleep was impossible. He shifted, turned, then lay still again. The image of Ethan, standing at his door, hesitating, looped in his mind. Was it an accident? Did he need something? Or was he waiting? Waiting for Richard to do what? The past flashed through his mind in sharp fragments. The stolen glances. The way Ethan sometimes spoke to him, not as a son, but as a man who saw through another man's walls. It was reckless. It was impossible. It was... Richard sat up abruptly, running a hand through his graying hair. He needed to stop this. This wasn't a road he could afford to travel. He had buried those desires for decades. He had built a life on denial. He had a wife, a son, a reputation. He wouldn't ruin it now. Richard reached for his whiskey glass on the nightstand, only to find it empty. He sighed, swung his legs over the bed, and stood. The house was dark as he stepped into the hallway. He moved quietly, heading downstairs to the kitchen. Pour, sip, breathe. But the moment of solitude didn't last long. A voice, smooth and knowing, cut through the silence. Couldn't sleep. Richard turned. Ethan stood in the doorway, shirtless, his toned frame barely visible in the dim kitchen light. He leaned casually against the frame, watching his father with an expression that felt both familiar and unsettling. Richard forced a chuckle. Guess not. Ethan smirked. Me neither. A pause, the kind that stretched too long. Richard cleared his throat. You need something? Ethan didn't answer immediately. Instead, He stepped forward, closing the distance between them. His gaze never wavered, and in that moment, Richard felt it again. The pull. The weight of everything unsaid pressing down on him. "I was just thinking," Ethan finally said, voice low, "about how weird it must be for you." Richard frowned. "What?" Ethan tilted his head slightly. "Pretending." Richard's breath hitched. He gripped his glass tighter. "Go to bed, Ethan." Ethan chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "Sure. Good night, Dad." He turned and walked away, leaving Richard standing there, pulse hammering, heart pounding. It wasn't the words that unsettled him the most. It was the certainty in Ethan's voice, like he already knew how this story would end. The night was thick with silence, but Richard's mind was anything but quiet. He stood in the dim kitchen, gripping his whiskey glass, staring at the spot where Ethan had been only moments ago. Pretending. The word lingered like an echo in his head. He had spent decades mastering the art of it. Yet a single conversation with his son had unraveled something inside him. Ethan wasn't a child anymore. He was a man, observant, fearless, and dangerously perceptive. He had seen what Richard had spent years denying, and worse, he had named it. Richard drained the last of his whiskey and exhaled. He needed sleep. He needed distance. But as he climbed the stairs and reached his bedroom, the air felt heavier, charged with something unspoken. He hesitated before shutting the door behind him, locking it as if that alone could keep his thoughts at bay. It didn't. A door left open. Richard lay in bed, eyes closed but body tense. Sleep eluded him, every breath feeling weighted. The house was still, until it wasn't. A soft creak, the sound of a door opening down the hall. His breath hitched. He knew that sound. Ethan's door. Footsteps followed, slow and deliberate. They didn't pass his room. They stopped. Richard swallowed hard. The air shifted. Even through the closed door, he could sense the presence on the other side. A pause, a hesitation, and then a knock. Soft, almost cautious. But Richard heard it like a drumbeat in his chest. Seconds stretched. He told himself not to answer, that he was imagining things, that nothing was happening. But his feet moved before he could stop them. He reached for the doorknob, pulse hammering. And then, as if sensing his hesitation, the knock came again. A test. A challenge. He turned the lock and opened the door. Ethan stood there, shirtless, arms crossed over his chest. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes held something Richard didn't want to name. Neither of them spoke at first. The silence was heavy, thick with unsaid things. Richard cleared his throat, grasping for normalcy. "It's late." Ethan smirked, leaning against the doorframe. "Yeah, couldn't sleep." Richard nodded, though he wasn't sure what to say next. His fingers still rested on the doorknob, as if he could close the door on this moment before it went any further. But Ethan didn't move, and Richard didn't step back. Seconds stretched too long, and then Ethan said it. "You ever think about what it would be like?" Richard's breath stalled. "What?" Ethan tilted his head slightly, his smirk deepening. Not pretending. It was a knife to the gut. Richard clenched his jaw, his entire body locking up. "Ethan, go back to bed." Ethan didn't move. If anything, he stepped closer. Richard's heart pounded. He knew he should end this. Shut the door. Walk away. But he didn't. He couldn't. Because Ethan was right. He had spent his entire life pretending. And for the first time, someone was daring him to stop. Ethan didn't push. He didn't have to. His presence alone was enough to make Richard's carefully constructed world start to crack. Richard exhaled, stepping back just enough for Ethan to enter the room. The door closed behind them, and the night swallowed the rest. The morning light was unforgiving. It sliced through the curtains, illuminating the room in sharp contrast. The warmth of the sun against the cold reality of waking up. Richard sat at the edge of his bed, elbows on his knees, head in his hands. His heartbeat had finally settled, but the tightness in his chest remained. The night before felt like a dream, yet the remnants of it clung to him like smoke, impossible to ignore. He hadn't slept. Down the hall, he heard the sound of movement, footsteps, the sound of a drawer opening, water running in the bathroom. The usual morning routine, except nothing felt usual anymore. Ethan was awake, and Richard had no idea what to say to him. He forced himself to go downstairs, hoping the simple act of brewing coffee would ground him. He needed something normal, something to anchor himself before facing the day. The smell of roasted beans filled the kitchen, offering a sense of familiarity. He focused on that, on the mundane steps of pouring, stirring, sipping. But then he heard it, the sound of footsteps descending the stairs. Ethan walked in, casual as ever, moving to the fridge and grabbing a bottle of water. His posture was loose, his expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Richard cleared his throat. "Morning." Ethan smirked as he twisted the cap off the bottle. "Morning, Dad." There was something in his voice, light, teasing, as if everything were normal. But Richard knew better. He knew when someone was holding back. And Ethan was holding back. Richard turned to the sink, gripping the edge of the counter. His fingers were white against the marble. "We should talk." Ethan leaned against the island, taking a slow sip of water. "About what?" Richard exhaled sharply. He wasn't in the mood for games. Ethan chuckled, setting his bottle down. "Relax. No one's asking you to explain yourself." Richard turned to face him, eyes narrowing. "Ethan, I get it." Ethan interrupted, voice even. "You're panicking, thinking about what it means, what it changes. But you don't have to." He tilted his head slightly, studying his father. "Unless you want to." Richard bristled. The way Ethan spoke, so sure of himself, so certain, it was unsettling. "This can't happen again," Richard said finally. Ethan held his gaze for a moment, then smirked. "Sure." It wasn't an argument. It wasn't even a promise. Just a word. And Richard didn't know whether to be relieved or unnerved. The rest of the day was careful, controlled. Richard worked from his home office, drowning himself in reports and emails, anything to keep his mind from wandering. Every so often, he heard Ethan moving around the house, watching TV, making calls, living his life as if nothing had changed. Maybe for him, nothing had. But for Richard, everything felt different. At lunch, they sat across from each other, eating in silence. Not tense, not uncomfortable, just quiet. Then Ethan spoke. "So, when's Mom coming back?" Richard swallowed his bite of food. "Friday." Ethan nodded. "You miss her?" The question was casual, but Richard felt its weight. He set down his fork, meeting his son's gaze. "Of course." Ethan studied him for a second before nodding again. "Good." That was the end of it. But Richard knew what Ethan was really asking. "Do you regret your life?" And Richard wasn't sure of the answer. By evening, the house felt heavier. The day had passed in a blur of restraint, both men carefully maneuvering around what had changed. But the weight of unspoken words lingered. Richard sat in the living room, a book in his hands he wasn't actually reading. He heard Ethan moving upstairs, the creak of a floorboard, the sound of a door closing. He sighed, rubbing his temple. He needed clarity, space. Then his phone buzzed. A message from Margaret. "Miss you. Can't wait to be home." Richard stared at the words longer than he should have. Margaret, his wife, his anchor. For 23 years, she had been the foundation of his life. He had built a family with her, a home. But now, for the first time, he wondered, had he built a lie? That night, Richard stayed in his room, door locked. He heard Ethan move past his door, just like the night before. He wondered if Ethan would stop, if he would hesitate again. But this time, Ethan didn't knock. Instead, he kept walking. And Richard lay awake, staring at the ceiling, knowing that something between them had shifted, something irreversible, something he couldn't take back. The next morning, Richard awoke to the sound of distant movement. Drawers opening, footsteps down the hall, the low hum of running water. The house was alive with routine, but nothing about it felt normal. He sat up slowly, his body tense, as if even the act of waking up required caution. The weight of the past 2 days pressed against his chest, heavy and inescapable. A glance at the clock, 7:12 a.m. Ethan would be leaving soon. Richard exhaled and ran a hand through his hair. He had spent the entire night thinking, dissecting, questioning every moment, every word, every choice. He had convinced himself that by morning he would have clarity. But all he had was the same gnawing uncertainty. He found Ethan in the kitchen, already dressed, sipping coffee by the counter. A duffel bag sat by the door, half-zipped, the straps hanging loosely. "You're heading out early," Richard said, keeping his tone even. Ethan glanced up, offering a small smirk. "Figured I'd get back to my place. Give you some space." Richard nodded. He didn't argue. He didn't ask him to stay. For a moment, they stood in silence, neither willing to be the first to break it. Then Ethan set his mug down. "You don't have to say anything, you know." Richard exhaled, gripping the back of a chair. "That's the problem, Ethan. I feel like I do." Ethan studied him carefully. "Why?" "Because," Richard hesitated, words failing him. "Because what?" "Because he was confused? Because his life had been built on denial? Because for the first time, he was standing at the edge of a truth he wasn't sure he was ready to face?" Ethan waited, patient, as if he already knew the answer. Richard sighed. "What happened these past few days, it can't happen again." Ethan's expression didn't change. "I know." Richard frowned slightly. "That's it." Ethan chuckled softly. "What else do you want me to say? That you should leave Mom? That you should chase some truth you've spent decades running from?" He shook his head. "You won't. And I'm not here to convince you." Richard swallowed. The words should have brought relief. Instead, they settled in his chest like lead. Ethan grabbed his bag and slung it over his shoulder. He hesitated for the first time, as if debating whether or not to say what was on his mind. Then, quietly, "I just hope, someday, you stop lying to yourself." Richard flinched, not because it was cruel, but because it was true. He didn't respond. Couldn't. Ethan nodded once, as if that was answer enough. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out the door. Richard didn't stop him. An empty house. The silence after Ethan left was deafening. Richard sat in the kitchen for a long time, staring at nothing, hands wrapped around a coffee mug gone cold. The house felt larger now, emptier, as if something had been removed from it. Or maybe something had been exposed. By midday, he found himself pacing. The restlessness in his chest refused to subside, no matter how many distractions he threw in its way. His phone buzzed. "Margaret, can't wait to see you. Almost home." Richard inhaled sharply. This was the life he knew, the life he had built. And yet, for the first time, he wondered if he had built it for himself, or for the version of himself he had always been expected to be. That evening, Richard stood at the window, watching the driveway as Margaret's car pulled in. She stepped out, radiant as always, moving with the familiar grace of a woman who had everything in order. When she entered the house, she smiled, dropping her bags and wrapping her arms around him. "I missed you," she murmured against his shoulder. Richard closed his eyes, breathed her in, held her a second too long, as if trying to convince himself that this was where he belonged. "I missed you too," he said softly. And maybe in some way it was true, but deep down, buried beneath layers of control and obligation, was another truth, one he wasn't ready to face. Not yet, maybe not ever.